Hello everyone and welcome to Retro Reviews, my channel where I review my favorite retro video games of all time as well as some modern releases I have recently finished. Today I'm going to be talking about a modern release that I absolutely adore, that I've sunk so much time into and most recently played, and that is FromSoftware's Bloodborne. I plan on going through the entire From Software pantheon for the Soulsborne series, and I really love Bloodborne. There's a few good reasons why right off the bat. First and foremost, this was the first Souls game that I ever touched. I got it free on PlayStation Plus. I had heard so much praise about it. I wasn't really into the whole idea of the Dark Souls series, so I was a little hesitant. But one day I decided I was going to get into it because my buddy was really good at the games. He knew a lot about them. He understood the finer details about how the systems work. And so I decided I'd jump in. I got through the first boss, maybe the second boss, and got stuck. And I was getting frustrated. And I remember telling him, like, hey, I just can't figure out how to get past this. Like, these enemies feel like way over leveled. And he's like, well, what level is your axe at? And I was like, what's that? Just didn't realize you had to be upgrading your axe as well as your character. So after a little bit of explaining how the mechanics worked, I was able to get into that side of things pretty quickly and figure out how to actually progress in the game. And it went a lot smoother after that. And my experience was really enjoyable. Like I said, I hadn't played any of the other From Software games up to this point. I wasn't a fan of the Dark Souls series in general, just from the people that I'd interacted with that talked about it. But I just had a great time with Bloodborne. It was incredibly difficult. It was fast paced. I love that the idea of not blocking, that was a big thing for me. I love that it really had a focus on precision attacking and dodges, well-timed dodges, and counter-attacking. I think the pace of Bloodborne is absolutely fantastic. I really love how they pushed up, now from, like, as a retrospective, after playing the Dark Souls games, I love how they paced up the combat from those games and made it so fluid and fast. There's also so many options in terms of weapons that you can do. Now, I'm a pretty basic Souls player, action RPG player. Whenever I play an RPG, I typically tend to play as the guy with the big sword, the big axe, the big whatever it is, and I swing really hard. I hit hard, I get out. That's the kind of style I like. I like the melee builds. I like getting up close and personal. So I just pulled out, I think I started off with the bone saw, and my buddy was like, the axe is probably better if you want to just do the hand axe. I'll teach you some stuff about it. I'm like, cool. So I swapped to that, had a great time. I loved it. So I really like to get up close and personal. I don't experiment a lot, but I had a fun time because of how well the mechanics work in this game, experimenting with how the axe worked in conjunction with the gun. Now, I love one other mechanic that's, again, one of the big things that I love about this game is the switching mechanic. Each weapon has a special function. If you press a button, it will change from one version of itself to another. The hand axe, for instance, goes from a single hand axe into a double-handed long axe, and you can use it with longer startup attacks that do more hit stun and do a little bit more damage. I loved the versatility this had. I'd be doing a combo with the short axe and then switch mid combo into the long axe and finish it off. I would also, you have to kind of play around with sacrificing the gun in the other hand. The gun is used for countering attacks. Since you don't have a shield, you're not parrying. Instead, you're shooting them right as they're most vulnerable, about to hit you. So you have to kind of play around with this. Is it worth having the two-handed axe where I can do some more hit stun, maybe stun the enemy, keep them at bay, or is it more important to have the gun out and be able to stun? It seems like a simple kind of rock, paper, scissors type thing, but it can get really intense, especially when multiple enemies are mobbing you. And they will. There are plenty of times where the enemies that precede a boss are incredibly dangerous because of how many of them there are. I love how well that they designed the difficulty of the enemies and the runs to the bosses. They're not janky or too difficult like I experienced in Dark Souls 2. I didn't really like the boss runs, thought they were too hard. There were some times where I wouldn't even get close to getting to the boss, and I'd just die over and over and over again. Bloodborne, it felt like I can do this, but I have to get a really good game plan. I've got to figure out what I'm doing. I need to figure out the best weapon. I need to figure out the best combination of what I'm going to be doing. And that just speaks to how well this was designed from a combat perspective. You can tell there was a lot of elbow grease put into the combat of Bloodborne. It's really fast, it's really fluid, but you also have to be thinking really quickly. You have to be thinking on your toes, because if you don't, you're going to get caught by a mob of enemies and not know what to do. You're going to start swinging around, you're going to get shot by someone from a distance, you're going to get hit by a guy swinging a torch. If they're heavier enemies, they might swing a giant axe down on you. You have to be really intentional about how you play this game. And I love that. I love the dodging mechanic as well. I'm not one to want to block in action RPGs. I like sidestepping instead. I like the idea of getting the reduced I don't like having the reduced actionable frames after taking a block. I don't like hitting block stun, so I like to get the iframes and dodge an attack. So I have more openings to attack. And Bloodborne plays into that perfectly for me. So for me, the combat system is everything I want in an action RPG. It's absolutely fantastic. Another difference between Bloodborne and the other Souls games, the typical ones that you have in pretty much every other Souls game at this point, you don't have a healing mechanic that's as similar. You have what's called blood vials. You have a max of 20 from the start. You can gather blood vials off of corpses, and they are used to heal you a certain amount. It's like a third, something like that. It's a small percentage at the very beginning. As you upgrade your character, it does a base percent that you're going to be doing. So it's a really interesting idea that you can gather more healing items as you progress throughout the run toward a new boss or a new area. You don't have to be making sure you're managing the healing nearly as much. Now, the blood vials are very finicky because they don't recover a whole ton of health. They're pretty fast. You stab them into you pretty quickly, but you have to make sure you're managing them at the same time because they don't heal a lot of health. You sometimes have to stab yourself 2-3 times in a row, and sometimes you don't have that opening. So you have to be really intentional about when you're dodging, when you're healing, when you're attacking. You have to balance all of these things really well. I like the idea. I think I still prefer the traditional Dark Souls with Estus Flask, and you only have a set amount that you only can get back once you get back to the bonfire. I think there are some special circumstances as well that return that to you in later games like Elden Ring. Some enemies will give you some heals back, but I think I prefer that better, but I really enjoy the blood vial system. I remember booting it up recently. I got the Old Hunters DLC. I'd never played through it. That was my reintroduction to Bloodborne recently. After I finished the rest of the Souls series, I finished Dark Souls 3. I'm like, I'm going to jump back in, finish the Old Hunters DLC, and then I'll play the entire pantheon of the FromSoft, the Souls games. I think I like the blood vial mechanic. I think it's interesting and unique enough. I like that it's different from the other games just for the sake of being different. And it fits the theme really, really well. I just enjoy it. I think I like the Estus Flask better, but the blood vial is still pretty cool. There are also some other things that you can do in combat. A lot of stuff that I didn't experiment with a whole ton. You can do things like hurting yourself to give you a blood vial and use it later. There's then all sorts of things with buffing your weapons, and I love the ideas posed in these. I've seen a lot of YouTube shorts, especially, showing off what you can do with some of the insane weapons that you have. If you spec into blood magic, you can do all sorts of crazy combos. You can turn into a beast momentarily, let out some like atrocious scream. You can stab yourself with a giant thing, and then after like a ton of frames, you pull it out, and it's this massive, terrifying weapon that can essentially one-shot a lot of things. I love how versatile each of the weapons is and how expansive the options are for you to play this game, like most games in the Souls franchise. But Bloodborne has a special extra bit because of all the switching mechanics. Have you 2 versions of each weapon, all this blood magic that you can do. The combos are essentially infinite. It's so fantastic. I love seeing people's experimentation with Bloodborne on YouTube. It's really quite inspiring to see. Like I said, I didn't experiment with a lot of those things, but I love that you can. I love that you can go in as a melee guy like me and just bash your head against the wall with a hand axe the entire game and only level up your strength and your dexterity stats, get your stamina up and your health, and that's it. You don't have to worry about anything else. Or you can go a completely different route and spec into blood magic and do all sorts of crazy, wacky stuff. That's what I really love about any From Software game, is how much versatility they give to the player to let them experiment and make the game their own. Now, this is a very difficult game. I think it's probably, if it's not the hardest game in the series for me, it's got to be number 2. I struggled with this game a lot, but the overcoming those struggles was also so much fun. I loved that each boss felt like a really strong challenge. And just when you felt like you were getting over the hump, the original, like, I'm getting through the difficulty in this game, now I understand it and I can adapt to it. They'll throw something at you like the Shadows of Yharnam with 3 boss fights at the same time. Stuff like that really keeps you on your toes the entire way through. I also love the motifs of Bloodborne. I love this idea of blood, the DNA just spattered throughout the entire game. I don't know a whole lot about the lore. That's not what this video is all about. I'm sure there's tons of videos on the lore of Bloodborne, but I love how much I gleaned from it. All the cutscenes, all the little bits and pieces you pick up along the way contributes to a really sad and harrowing story, or stories, as you progress throughout this game. Pretty much every NPC in this game talks about blood in some format. You'll learn about things like the old ones and why they're important or relevant at all. Some of the bosses are really important lore-wise, and killing them alters the world state entirely for the rest of the game. The lore of Bloodborne is really cool, and I can tell, even as a more casual consumer of the lore, I can tell it's very deep, very intentional, and incredibly satisfying. I talked with my friend about it, and he told me some of the lore things that he enjoyed. I'm like, oh, I didn't even catch that. I never would have caught some of the things that go on. And that's what's really cool about any From Software game, but especially Bloodborne. It's incredibly deep, and you can go as deep as you want into this lore to really get more out of this experience. There's also an optional final boss after the final boss, the traditional final boss. You can, if you've done a bunch of these side quest things, getting umbilical cord pieces, you can fight the Blood Moon Presence, which is a terrifying entity. I remember when I first finally beat the final boss and I triggered this secret final boss ending, again with the help of my buddy, since I wasn't privy to all of how to get all the extra things. He helped me find them. I remember getting to that boss and being extremely terrified. One, because I didn't have any healing items left going into the fight for the very first time, and it's very grotesque. All of the enemies, all of the bosses especially, are very grotesque. They lean into this blood theme incredibly well and incredibly terrifyingly. It's oh man, it's just pretty gross, I'm going to say, straight off the bat. There's almost nothing in this game that isn't pretty disgusting, gross out material. And it really works too. You're not going into this game blind. You know, Bloodborne, this is going to be a bloody, violent, visceral game. And it leans into that so well, and it just contributes to this world that you're experiencing. It's very bleak. It's very dark. I love the setting. It's very Victorian, and you got things like supernatural, like the werewolves, and it's really well crafted all around. Everything works together. Everything feeds into itself to make this stunning backdrop that you get to experience as you play through this game. I think the enemy designs and the boss designs are especially top tier. I think this is the best they've ever done. I love Sekiro as well. Their boss designs, I think they're pretty thematically on point. But there's something special about Bloodborne for me, and even revisiting it with the Old Hunters DLC, I remembered almost immediately why I fell in love with this game and wanted to try out the rest of the From Software experiences. Now, let's talk about the Old Hunters DLC a little bit. It kicked my absolute teeth in right off the bat. This is probably the hardest DLC I've ever experienced, and that includes stuff like the Dark Souls 3 DLC, some of the Dark Souls 2 DLC, some of the hardest bosses in Elden Ring, including Millennia. I think the Old Hunters is the hardest experience I've ever had. And it's funny because Orphan of Kos is usually highlighted as the most difficult boss, at least that I've seen for most people. But man, I got my teeth kicked in by the very first boss. Ludwig was absolutely out of this world, so difficult for me. I probably bashed my head against the wall for 3 to 5 hours, somewhere in that range. I didn't keep track. There were a couple gaming sessions where I just couldn't get any ground, and it was so demoralizing. Part of it I know was I was on a New Game Plus file. I had accidentally started a new game forever ago, and so when I jumped back in, I had to beat a bunch of the bosses first. I capped out my stats the way I wanted them to be. So I know that the New Game Plus probably contributed to that, but from what I've seen, most people say that Ludwig is also really challenging on a first run through as well. So I had a really, really difficult time. It was frustrating, and it was just as enjoyable as it was frustrating at the same time. I think that strikes the balance perfectly. You will get frustrated over and over and over again. It'll make you so angry, but the anger drives you to complete it instead of being like, I'm going to give up. I really had that drive to complete the Old Hunters DLC. And once I finally got past Ludwig, I had an easier time. But that's not to say the rest of the Old Hunters is particularly easy at all. In fact, it just got so much more terrifying as I knew I was leading up to the Orphan of Kos. That fight was slightly easier for me than it was Ludwig, but also incredibly brutal. The way Orphan of Kos goes about the battlefield and attacks you and is relentless in its pursuit of you, I think really is a nice encapsulation of Bloodborne as a whole. The Orphan of Kos kind of highlights everything strong about the bosses you faced so far and then cranks it up to 11. It's fast, big hitboxes, long range. You have to be exact with your execution if you're going to beat this boss fight, or get extremely lucky. Probably a combination of both. I had a couple runs where I got really lucky and avoided a few things that I probably should have gotten hit by, just mashing the dodge button as much as I could. But the more precision that you have in a fight, especially like that, the more success you have. And that's really the story about this of the entirety of Bloodborne. The more precise you are with this game, the more time you put into learning the game's mechanics and systems, the more you'll find success, the more you'll find enjoyment in this game. You can mash your way to victory up to a certain point, but after that, you're really going to have to dig in deep if you want to beat this game. I love it. I love how difficult it is. I love how how the themes just come together so well. Bloodborne is my favorite From Software game, and revisiting it just solidified that for me. I'm going to give Bloodborne a platinum rank, and an absolute must play for anybody that loves the From Software games, if you've played the Dark Souls series, or if you just love brutally difficult challenges. Thank you so much. I will see you on the next one.